Sarah Chen kept her head down as she methodically loaded ammunition into the supply crates aboard the USS Valiant, her calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency while other crew members chatted around her. She had been working the night shift for 3 months now, deliberately choosing the hours when fewer officers roamed the deck and questions were rarely asked. The small bronze medal hidden beneath her uniform pressed against her chest like a burning secret, and she adjusted, her collar nervously when footsteps approached. But tonight was different, because Admiral Morrison was conducting an unexpected inspection of the ammunition bay, and his sharp eyes seemed to notice everything that others missed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal walls as Sarah continued her work, trying to appear invisible among the towering stacks of artillery shells and ammunition boxes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted each round, checking the serial numbers against her clipboard, while her mind raced through the carefully rehearsed story she would tell if anyone questioned her presence here. The metal beneath her shirt felt heavier with each passing moment, a constant reminder of why she had infiltrated this ship and risked everything to get close to the man who had destroyed her family. 3 decks above them, the Admiral was making his way down through the ship, conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection. But Sarah knew better because she had been monitoring his communications for weeks. The timing was too convenient, and his sudden interest in the ammunition stores felt like more than coincidence. She had been so careful to blend in with the other enlisted personnel, keeping her head down and avoiding attention, while she gathered the evidence she needed to expose the truth about what happened in Vietnam 30 years ago. The other crew members working the night shift were mostly young sailors who treated the ammunition loading as just another boring duty assignment. They joked quietly among themselves about their weekend plans and complained about the endless paperwork that came with handling explosives. Sarah envied their innocence and wished she could share their casual attitude toward military life instead of carrying the weight of her father's memory and the burning need for justice that had consumed her for the past 5 years. She had spent months learning everything about Admiral Morrison, studying his career, his habits, his weaknesses, and his carefully constructed public image as a war hero. The man was scheduled to retire in 6 months with full honors and a pension that would set him up for life unless Sarah could prove that his distinguished service record was built on lies and the sacrifice of better men than himself. The medal hidden against her chest was just the beginning of the evidence she had collected, but it was the most personal piece, because it had belonged to her father, Staff Sergeant David Chen, who had died in a Vietnamese prison camp after Morrison abandoned his unit to save his own career. The sound of boots on metal stairs echoed through the ammunition bay, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of military bearing. The Admiral was getting closer, and she could hear his voice as he questioned crew members on the upper levels about security protocols and inventory procedures. She forced herself to continue working at the same steady pace, even though every instinct told her to run or hide somewhere in the maze of corridors that honeycombed the massive ship. Her hands moved automatically as she loaded another crate with artillery shells. But her mind was focused on the small recording device hidden in her boot and the backup transmitter sewn into the lining of her jacket. She had spent 2 years learning how to use the equipment and another year practicing until she could operate it without looking or making any suspicious movements. The plan was simple in theory, but terrifyingly complex in execution. She needed to get Morrison alone and force him to confess to abandoning her father's unit while recording everything for the world to hear. The metal pressed against her skin like a brand, reminding her of the photograph she had found in her father's belongings after her mother died. The picture showed her father wearing the Bronze Star for valor earned during a rescue mission that saved 12 American soldiers from a Viet Cong ambush. But according to the official records, that same medal had been awarded posthumously to Admiral Morrison for his heroic leadership during the exact same battle. The discrepancy had taken Sarah 3 years to uncover, and another 2 years to understand the full scope of Morrison's deception. She could hear the Admiral getting closer now, his voice carrying clearly through the metal corridors as he discussed ammunition storage. Procedures with the duty officer. Sarah knew she had perhaps 5 minutes before he reached this section of the ship, and she still needed to position herself where she could get close enough to confront him without alerting the other crew members. The recording equipment would be useless if there were witnesses because Morrison would simply deny everything and have her arrested for assault or insubordination. The weight of the ammunition rounds felt insignificant compared to the weight of responsibility she carried for her father's memory and for all the other soldiers who had been abandoned or betrayed by officers, more concerned with their own careers than the lives of their men. Sarah had read every after-action report from that battle in Vietnam, and she knew that Morrison had deliberately left her father's unit behind when the situation became dangerous, choosing to save himself and a handful of his staff rather than risk his own life to rescue the men under his command. Footsteps were getting louder now, and Sarah could feel sweat beating on her forehead despite the cool air in the ammunition bay. She adjusted her collar one more time, making sure the metal was completely hidden while she prepared herself for the confrontation that would either vindicate her father's sacrifice or destroy any chance she had of exposing the truth about Admiral Morrison and his carefully constructed legacy of lies and cowardice. The Admiral paused directly behind Sarah as she bent over a particularly heavy crate of shells, and she could feel his presence like a shadow falling across her work. When she straightened up, her loose collar shifted just enough to reveal the edge of the metal hanging from its faded ribbon. Morrison stepped closer, his weathered face showing recognition that made Sarah's blood run cold. She quickly pulled her collar back into place, but it was too late because the Admiral had seen the distinctive bronze star with its red, white, and blue ribbon. The same metal that had been reported stolen from his private quarters 6 months ago, along with classified documents that could destroy several military careers, including his own. Morrison stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his pale blue eyes fixed on the spot where the metal had been visible just moments before Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she tried to maintain the appearance of a routine work detail while her mind raced through possible escape routes and contingency plans. The other crew members continued their work oblivious to the deadly tension that had suddenly filled the ammunition bay, but Sarah knew that her carefully constructed cover identity was about to crumble under the Admiral's scrutiny. The Admiral cleared his throat softly, and Sarah forced herself to turn around, meeting his gaze with what she hoped looked like innocent confusion rather than the terror that was clawing at her chest. Morrison was shorter than she had expected from seeing him at a distance, but his presence filled the space around him with an authority that came from decades of commanding men in life and death situations. His uniform was immaculate despite the late hour, and his silver hair was perfectly groomed, even though he had been conducting inspections throughout the ship for the past 3 hours. Petty Officer Chen Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise of the ship, but not enough to attract attention from the other workers. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized he knew her real name, despite all the forged documents and false identities she had used to get aboard the USS Valiant the months of preparation. And careful planning suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate against the resources and experience of a man who had spent his entire career dealing with threats to national security. Yes, Sir Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking as she set down the ammunition round she had been holding. Morrison stepped closer until he was close enough that she could smell his aftershave and see the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into ocean horizons and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The metal felt like it was burning against her chest, and she had to resist the urge to touch the spot where it lay hidden. "I think we need to have a conversation, Morrison," said his tone conversational, but with an underlying steel that made it clear this was not a request. Sarah glanced around at the other crew members who were still focused on their work assignments, completely unaware that their routine night shift had just become something far more dangerous. The Admiral followed her gaze and nodded slightly as if he understood her concern about witnesses. The ammunition bay stretched out around them, filled with enough explosive power to level several city blocks, and Sarah realized with growing horror that Morrison had chosen this location deliberately. The isolation and the inherent danger of their surroundings gave him significant advantages. In whatever confrontation was about to unfold, she had planned for many scenarios, but being trapped in a confined space surrounded by high explosives while facing a man who had already proven his willingness to sacrifice lives for his own benefit had not been among them. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and Sarah tensed, preparing to run or fight, depending on what he produced, but instead of a weapon he pulled out a small photograph that he held up for her to see. The image showed a young soldier in Vietnam-era fatigues standing next to a helicopter with his arm around another man in officer's uniform. Sarah recognized her father immediately, despite the decades that had passed since the picture was taken, but the officer beside him was unmistakably a younger version of Admiral Morrison. "Your father was a good soldier," Morrison said quietly, studying Sarah's face for her reaction. "He saved a lot of lives during that mission, including mine." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes as she stared at the photograph because it was proof that Morrison had known her father personally and had been present during the battle that cost David Chen his life. The casual way the Admiral spoke about her father's sacrifice made her anger flare hot and bright despite the dangerous situation she found herself in. The other crew members were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening as Morrison and Sarah stood facing each other in what was clearly more than a routine inspection. Sarah could see Petty Officer Rodriguez glancing in their direction with growing curiosity, while Seaman Williams had stopped working entirely to watch the exchange. The Admiral seemed to sense the attention they were attracting, because he gestured toward a narrow corridor that led deeper into the ammunition storage area, away from the main workspace. Morrison began walking toward the corridor without waiting to see if Sarah would follow, and she realized she had no choice but to comply because running would only confirm his suspicions and alert the entire ship to her presence. The corridor was barely wide enough for two people and lined on both sides with secured storage lockers containing various types of ammunition and explosive devices. The fluorescent lighting was dimmer here, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers. As they walked deeper into the storage area, Sarah could feel the weight of the ship around them pressing down like the ocean itself, and she understood that Morrison was taking her somewhere completely isolated where no one would hear what happened next. The metal against her chest felt heavier with each step, and she wondered if her father had felt this same sense of impending doom during his final moments in that Vietnamese prison camp. The Admiral moved with the confidence of a man who was completely in control of the situation, and Sarah realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her father's sacrifice would finally be avenged or whether his memory would die with her in the depths of this floating arsenal. Morrison ordered the other crew members to leave the ammunition bay immediately, and Sarah found herself alone with the man whose life she had been systematically destroying through carefully leaked information to foreign contacts. The metal wasn't just stolen property, it was evidence of her father's heroic service in Vietnam. Father Morrison had left behind enemy lines 30 years ago to save his own career. Sarah had spent years tracking down the truth about her father's abandonment, and the metal was proof of Morrison's cowardice. But now, as she stood surrounded by enough explosives to sink the entire ship, she realized the Admiral had been setting a trap, and she had walked directly into it. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind the last departing crew member, leaving Sarah and Morrison alone in the cavernous ammunition storage bay that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a workspace. The Admiral moved with deliberate precision as he activated the electronic locks that would prevent anyone from entering without his authorization code. Sarah watched his movements with growing dread as she understood that he had planned this confrontation down to the smallest detail, including the location and timing that would give him maximum advantage. Morrison turned to face her fully for the first time since entering the storage area, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked now that the pretense of a routine inspection had been dropped. His pale eyes held a coldness that reminded her of winter storms, and his mouth was set in a thin line that spoke of decisions already made. The photograph of her father was still in his hand, but now he held it like evidence in a trial, rather than a memento of fallen comrades. "You look just like him," Morrison said quietly, his voice echoing strangely. In the metal-enclosed space, David had the same stubborn set to his jaw and the same fire in his eyes when he thought he was fighting for something important. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at the casual way he spoke her father's name as if they had been friends rather than the betrayer and the betrayed. The Admiral seemed to notice her reaction because his expression shifted slightly, showing what might have been regret or perhaps just calculation. "The medal you stole from my quarters." Morrison continued stepping closer until Sarah could see her own reflection in his polished insignia. "Belonged to your father originally, but it was transferred to me after his death, along with the commendation that went with it." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, because this was the first time anyone had admitted that the medal had originally been her father's, and that Morrison had somehow acquired it through official channels rather than earning it through his own actions. "Truth about what happened in Vietnam is more complicated than you understand," Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who had rehearsed this explanation many times in his own mind. "Your father volunteered for a mission that was essentially suicide, and I tried to talk him out of it, but he insisted on going because he believed it was the right thing to do." Sarah shook her head violently because she had read the after-action reports and witness statements that painted a very different picture of events. Morrison reached into another pocket and produced a thick manila envelope that he set on top of a nearby ammunition crate. The contents spilled out, revealing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be audio cassette tapes that Sarah had never seen before. "These are the real records from that mission," Morrison explained, "not the sanitized versions that made it into the official files. Your father discovered that our South Vietnamese allies were selling weapons to the Viet Cong, and he was going to expose the entire operation regardless of the political consequences." Sarah stared at the documents spread across the ammunition crate, trying to process what Morrison was telling her, because it contradicted everything she had believed about her father's death and the circumstances that led to it. The Admiral continued speaking, his voice growing more urgent, as if he was running out of time to explain decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Your father was killed not because I abandoned him, but because he refused to stay quiet about the corruption he had uncovered, and there were people on both sides who wanted him silenced." The recording device in Sarah's boot felt suddenly inadequate for capturing the complexity of what Morrison was revealing, and she wondered if this was another layer of deception designed to confuse her and make her doubt her own research. The Admiral seemed to sense her skepticism, because he picked up one of the audio tapes and held it toward her. "This is your father's voice recorded 3 days before he died, explaining everything he had discovered and why he felt compelled to act despite the danger to himself and his unit." Morrison walked over to an old cassette player that was mounted on the wall, apparently part of the ship's communication system, and inserted the tape. Sarah heard static for a moment, followed by her father's voice speaking with the same determined tone she remembered from her childhood. The recording was clearly authentic because no one could have faked the specific details and emotional inflections that were uniquely her father's, but the content was devastating to everything she had believed about his death. Her father's voice explained how he had discovered weapons shipments being diverted to enemy forces, and how he had tried to work through official channels only to be told that the operation was classified and beyond his security clearance. He spoke about his growing certainty that American soldiers were dying because of weapons sold by their own allies, and his determination to expose the truth, even if it cost him his career or his life. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her father struggle with the same moral dilemma that had driven her own quest for justice. Morrison stopped the tape and looked at Sarah with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Your father was a hero, but not in the way you thought he was, and I have spent 30 years carrying the weight of his sacrifice while building a career on the foundation of his silence." Sarah realized that everything she had believed about Morrison was wrong, and that her carefully planned revenge had been based on incomplete information and misunderstood motivations. The Admiral had not abandoned her father, but had been forced to watch him die for principles that were bigger than both of them. The medal against her chest now felt like a burden rather than a talisman, and Sarah understood that she had been fighting the wrong enemy while the real villains had remained hidden behind layers of classification and political expediency. Morrison was not the coward she had imagined, but rather another victim of a system that sacrificed good people to protect corrupt operations, and she had spent years destroying an innocent man while the guilty parties continued to profit from her father's death. The Admiral smiled coldly as he revealed that he had known about Sarah's true identity for weeks and had been feeding her false information to trace her network of contacts. The ammunition she had been loading was actually inert training rounds, but the real explosives were hidden throughout. The ship set to detonate in exactly 10 minutes. Sarah reached for the emergency alarm, but Morrison grabbed her wrist, showing her the detonator in his other hand. He explained that her father's medal would go down with the ship along with all evidence of his past crimes, and Sarah would be remembered as a terrorist who destroyed a U.S. Navy vessel. But Sarah smiled back because she had been recording everything on a device hidden in her boot, and the transmission was already being broadcast to every major news network in the country. The Admiral had finally confessed to abandoning her father, and now the whole world would know the truth, even if neither of them survived the next 9 minutes. Morrison released her wrist and stepped back, his expression shifting from cold calculation to something approaching panic as he realized the implications of what Sarah had just revealed. The detonator in his hand suddenly seemed less like a weapon and more like evidence of his own guilt, and Sarah could see him mentally calculating how much of their conversation had been recorded and transmitted. The Admiral had spent decades carefully constructing his public image, and now everything was unraveling in real time as news networks across the country began broadcasting his confession to abandoning soldiers under his command. The ship around them seemed to pulse with hidden menace, as Morrison explained that the explosives were positioned at critical structural points designed to make the USS Valiant sink quickly and completely, taking all evidence of the Vietnam conspiracy to the bottom of the ocean, along with anyone who knew the truth. Sarah realized that this had never been about justice or revenge, but about covering up a decades-old weapons trafficking operation that had cost American lives and enriched corrupt officials on both sides of the conflict. Her father had died, not because Morrison was a coward, but because he had discovered something that powerful. People were willing to kill to protect. Morrison began pacing the narrow confines of the ammunition bay, his military bearing finally cracking under the pressure of exposure and imminent destruction. He explained that the weapons trafficking operation had continued long after the Vietnam War ended, evolving into a global network that supplied arms to conflicts around the world while generating billions in profits for a shadow organization that included high-ranking military officers, politicians, and defense contractors. Sarah understood that her quest for personal revenge had accidentally uncovered something much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Admiral stopped pacing and turned to face Sarah with desperation replacing the cold confidence he had displayed earlier. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice rising above the ambient noise of the ship. "Those people will kill anyone who threatens their operation, and now that your transmission has gone public, they will have to eliminate every possible witness, including you and everyone you care about. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's air conditioning, as she realized that exposing Morrison might have signed death warrants for herself and her remaining family members. Morrison continued explaining that he had been trying to protect her by discrediting her research and making her appear unstable rather than allowing her to get close enough to the truth to become a target. The weapons trafficking network had tentacles reaching into every level of government and military command, and they had been monitoring Sarah's investigation from the beginning, waiting to see how much she would discover before deciding whether to recruit her or eliminate her. The Admiral claimed that his plan to destroy the ship was actually an attempt to fake both their deaths and give them a chance to disappear before the real killers could find them. Sarah looked at the detonator in Morrison's hand and realized that he was telling the truth about the explosives, because she could hear subtle changes in the ship's engine rhythm that suggested critical systems were being compromised. The Admiral had not been lying about the 10-minute timeline, and she could feel the massive vessel beginning to list slightly as water entered compartments that should have remained sealed. Morrison explained that he had spent months preparing this elaborate deception, including arranging for a submarine to pick them up after the ship went down. The recording device in Sarah's boot continued transmitting even as she struggled to process the revelation that Morrison was trying to save her life rather than end it. The Admiral showed her detailed plans for new identities and safe houses that would allow them to survive long enough to expose the real conspiracy from hiding. Sarah realized that her father had died not because Morrison abandoned him, but because the weapons trafficking network had arranged his capture and execution to prevent him from revealing their operation to higher authorities. Morrison activated a hidden panel in the ammunition bay wall, revealing communication equipment that he used to contact the submarine, waiting beneath them. The Admiral explained that they had less than 5 minutes before the explosives detonated, and that Sarah would have to choose between her desire for public vindication and her chance for survival. The submarine crew had orders to surface only long enough to pick up survivors before disappearing into international waters where the weapons trafficking network could not easily reach them. Sarah looked around the ammunition bay that had become both a tomb and a potential escape route as she weighed her options against the ticking clock of Morrison's detonator. The Admiral was offering her a chance to continue her father's work by exposing the real conspiracy, but it would mean abandoning her old life and accepting that justice might take years or decades to achieve. Morrison explained that the weapons trafficking network had killed dozens of people over the years, including several journalists and investigators who had gotten too close to the truth. The ship shuddered around them as the first of the hidden explosives detonated in a compartment far below the waterline, and Sarah could hear alarms beginning to sound throughout the vessel. Morrison grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a hidden escape hatch that led directly to the ocean where the submarine was waiting. The Admiral explained that the crew above them would have enough time to reach lifeboats, and that the official investigation would conclude that the ship had been destroyed by a terrorist attack carried out by Sarah Chen, who had died in the explosion. Sarah hesitated at the escape hatch as she realized that accepting Morrison's offer would mean letting the world believe that her father had been a traitor and that she had been a terrorist. The Admiral seemed to understand her internal struggle because he showed her a waterproof case containing all the evidence they would need to eventually expose the weapons trafficking network, including documents that would clear her father's name and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy. The case also contained enough money and false identification documents to keep them hidden for years, while they built a case that could not be suppressed or discredited. The water rushing into the ship was getting louder, and Morrison warned Sarah that they had less than 2 minutes before the escape route would be flooded beyond use. The Admiral explained that the submarine crew included other people who had been forced to fake their deaths to escape the weapons trafficking network, and that Sarah would be joining a small but dedicated group of individuals working to expose the conspiracy. From the shadows, Sarah realized that her choice was between immediate vindication. That would likely get her killed, and long-term justice that might actually honor her father's. Sacrifice. Morrison opened the escape hatch, and cold ocean water began pouring into the ammunition bay as Sarah made her decision about whether to trust the man she had spent years trying to destroy. The Admiral extended his hand toward her as the ship continued its death spiral toward the ocean floor, and Sarah understood that the next few seconds would determine not only her survival, but the ultimate fate of the conspiracy that had cost her father his life and threatened to claim many more victims before it could be stopped. The recording device in her boot continued transmitting until the moment Sarah grabbed Morrison's hand and plunged through the escape hatch into the dark waters where a submarine waited to carry them toward an uncertain future, filled with danger, but also the possibility of real justice for her father and all the other victims of the weapons trafficking network that had operated in the shadows for far too long.